Join me as I dive deep into the chilling story of the real-life psycho that inspired Scream, and see if I can uncover the truth behind this horror legend. Daniel Rolling, though not as widely known as serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, or Ted Bundy, was equally depraved and dangerous. Nicknamed the Gainesville Ripper, Rolling unleashed a horrifying murder spree in August 1990 that left 5 Florida college students brutally slain over a period of just 4 days. His crimes, shocking and gruesome, sent shockwaves through the college town of Gainesville, Florida, and gripped the nation in fear. 4 years after his reign of terror, a screenwriter named Kevin Williamson happened to watch an episode of the ABC series Turning Point, which covered the Gainesville Ripper's heinous acts. The program left such a profound impact on Williamson that it inspired him to write a screenplay that would eventually evolve into the now iconic horror film Scream. Though Rolling didn't engage in prank calls or don a mask like the fictional Ghostface killer in the film, his grotesque brutality and his ability to instill terror in a quiet community deeply influenced Williamson. The Gainesville Ripper had planted seeds of dread in Williamson's mind, igniting the creative spark that led to the creation of one of the most enduring horror franchises in cinema. Rolling's murder spree began in the dead of night on Friday, August 24, 1990. Armed with a knife, he broke into the Gainesville apartment where 2 young college students, Christina Powell and Sonia Larson, were staying. Powell had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room. Despite the easy opportunity to strike her, Rolling didn't attack her immediately. Instead, he crept upstairs to where Sonia Larson was sleeping in her bed. Silently, he approached her, waking her just enough to overpower her. He gagged her with duct tape, ensuring that her cries wouldn't alert her roommate, and then viciously stabbed her to death in a frenzied assault. After murdering Larson, he returned downstairs to Christina Powell, who remained unaware of the horror unfolding above. Rolling proceeded to sexually assault Powell before murdering her in a similarly violent fashion. To further torment those who would later find the crime scene, Rolling meticulously posed the bodies of the 2 women in sexually suggestive positions, turning the crime into a grotesque spectacle. If that wasn't horrifying enough, Rolling, in a chilling display of control and nonchalance, took a shower in their apartment before calmly leaving the scene, his work there complete but far from over. This was just the beginning of the terror Rolling would inflict upon the Gainesville community. The very next night, Daniel Rolling struck again, continuing his horrifying spree with a terrifying sense of patience and premeditation. This time, his target was Krista Hoyt, a 19-year-old student who lived alone. What made this part of the case even more disturbing was that when Rolling broke into Hoyt's apartment, she wasn't home. Rather than leaving or seeking another victim, he decided to wait for her. Rolling spent the night alone in her apartment, lurking in the shadows, waiting for Krista to return. When she finally arrived the next morning, she had no idea that a killer had been lying in wait. As soon as she entered her apartment, Rolling ambushed her. He quickly overpowered Krista, binding her before subjecting her to a brutal sexual assault. Afterward, he stabbed her to death with the same cold precision he had shown in his earlier murders. But this time, his sadism reached an even more grotesque level. After posing her body for the police to find, Rolling decapitated Krista Hoyt, placing her head on a shelf, her lifeless eyes staring at the macabre scene he had orchestrated. This gruesome escalation of violence highlighted the depths of Rolling's depravity and further terrorized the Gainesville community. By the end of that blood-soaked weekend, Gainesville was gripped with panic. The brutal and senseless murders left the entire city in a state of shock and fear. For many, the crimes carried eerie echoes of the notorious Ted Bundy, who had similarly preyed on Florida college students more than a decade earlier in 1978. The parallels were unnerving. Both killers targeted young students in their homes, and both left behind chilling crime scenes that seemed designed to evoke horror. However, while Bundy had been caught and executed, Rolling was still at large, and the sense of dread in Gainesville continued to grow. Unfortunately, Rolling's killing spree was not over. Just 2 days later, on Monday, he struck again. This time, his violence extended to a new target, a man. Rolling broke into an apartment shared by Manuel "Manny" Taboada and Tracy Pauls. Taboada, a strong and athletic student, was the first to encounter Rolling. In a rare moment during the spree, Taboada attempted to fight back, struggling against the attacker. However, despite his strength, he was no match for Rolling, who fatally stabbed him. The commotion of the fight woke Tracy Pauls, who rushed to help her roommate, unaware of the lethal danger awaiting her. When she reached Manny's room, she came face to face with the killer. Realizing the danger, she fled to her bedroom, locking the door behind her in a desperate attempt to escape. Tragically, her efforts were in vain. Rolling broke through the door and overpowered her, stabbing her to death in another violent attack. As with his previous female victims, he posed Tracy Pauls's body in a sexualized manner, a twisted signature that he left behind at each of his crime scenes. Notably, Rolling did not mutilate or pose Manny Taboada, indicating that his primary targets were women and that the presence of a male victim had likely been unplanned. This pattern suggested that Rolling's murderous intent was focused on women, and Taboada had simply been an obstacle he hadn't anticipated. By the end of his rampage, Rolling had claimed the lives of 5 students in just 4 days, leaving a legacy of horror that would haunt Gainesville for years to come. After the Gainesville murders, Daniel Rolling seemingly went inactive, disappearing from the public eye for months. He could have remained in the shadows for the rest of his life, his reign of terror possibly ending there. However, his dark past would ultimately lead to his downfall. Investigators soon discovered that the 5 Florida college students were not Rolling's first victims. His killing spree had started nearly a year earlier in 1989. On November 4th of that year, Rolling brutally murdered a family of 3 in Shreveport, Louisiana. His victims were 55-year-old Tom Grissom, his 24-year-old daughter Julie, and her 8-year-old son Sean. Rolling had broken into their home, killing Tom and Sean swiftly, but with Julie his violence became more sinister and ritualistic. Much like his later victims in Florida, Rolling grotesquely posed Julie's body, a signature move meant to shock and horrify whoever discovered the crime scene. As in the Gainesville murders, Rolling left the male bodies relatively undisturbed, focusing his rage and brutality on the female victim. The similarities between the Shreveport murders and the Gainesville killings didn't go unnoticed by investigators, who began to suspect that the same killer was responsible for both. This theory was bolstered by forensic evidence gathered at the Shreveport crime scene, where the killer's blood had been found, revealing that he had type B blood. While this was a vital clue, it didn't immediately lead to the identification of the murderer. The investigation stalled, with the authorities still unsure who the man behind these gruesome acts was. Despite the chilling similarities between the 2 sets of murders, there was little else linking Rolling to the crimes until he made a fatal mistake, one that many killers make. He couldn't keep quiet. In Shreveport, long before his Florida rampage, Rolling had started attending a local church where he met a Christian couple named Cindy Juracich and Steve Dobbin. The couple, unaware of the darkness lurking within Rolling, initially befriended him and even invited him to their home on several occasions. However, it didn't take long for them to realize that something was deeply wrong with him. Rolling's behavior and troubling comments set off alarms for the couple. In a 2021 interview with ABC News, Cindy Juracich recalled her unsettling friendship with Rolling. He'd come over every night for a while, she explained, and then one night, Stephen came in and he goes, "He's got to go." The breaking point came when Rolling confided in Steve Dobbin, revealing a chilling detail about his dark impulses. During a conversation, Dobbin had asked Rolling what kind of problem he was struggling with, to which Rolling casually responded, "I like to stick knives into people." This horrifying admission sent shockwaves through the couple, who quickly distanced themselves from Rolling. At the time, they couldn't have known just how literal and deadly his words were. Although they didn't realize the full extent of his crimes at the time, Cindy Juracich would later piece together the chilling connection between Rolling's confession and the murders in Gainesville. It wasn't until after the Florida murders became national news that she recognized the man she had once known at her church. She contacted authorities with her suspicions, providing them with crucial information that would eventually help to link Daniel Rolling to both the Shreveport and Gainesville killings. By the time Daniel Rolling made his chilling confession about his violent impulses to Cindy Juracich and Steve Dobbin, the Shreveport murders had already occurred. Yet, at that moment, Juracich and Dobbin didn't fully grasp the gravity of his words. She dismissed the disturbing comments as the ramblings of a troubled man. It wasn't until Rolling's name surfaced again after the Gainesville murders, now part of a national investigation, that Juracich began to piece together a far more sinister picture. When investigators revealed that they suspected the same man was responsible for both the Shreveport and Gainesville killings, something about Rolling clicked in her memory. One of his offhand comments suddenly seemed to carry a darker meaning. In her interview with ABC News, Juracich recalled Rolling frequently talking about his desire to leave Shreveport for a place where he could indulge his fantasies. He always told us, "One day I'm going to leave this town, and I'm going to go where the girls are beautiful, and I can just lay in the sun and watch beautiful women all day," she said. That statement now struck her as more than just a casual dream. It felt like a confession in plain sight. Haunted by this realization, Juracich could no longer remain silent. She decided to call Crime Stoppers, believing that she had crucial information that could help identify the elusive killer. "I think there's one guy y'all need to investigate, Danny Rolling," she told them. Her tip couldn't have come at a more crucial time. Not only did her call provide investigators with a new and critical lead that would eventually lead to Rolling's capture, but it also potentially saved others from becoming future victims of his brutality. Moreover, Juracich's call may have saved the life of an innocent man, Edward Lewis Humphrey, who had become the prime suspect in the Gainesville murders. Humphrey, a troubled young man with a history of erratic behavior, had been arrested after beating his grandmother, and police were convinced that he was responsible for the string of killings. Humphrey's violent outburst and mental instability seemed to fit the profile of a killer, and with little else to go on, authorities zeroed in on him. The public, desperate for an arrest, was ready to believe that Humphrey was the Gainesville Ripper. However, thanks to Juracich's timely tip and the subsequent investigation that pointed squarely at Rolling, Humphrey was eventually cleared of any involvement. Despite his exoneration, some conspiracy theories have persisted, with a small number of people speculating that Humphrey may have been an accomplice or somehow involved in the crimes. Nonetheless, Rolling's solo acts of murder were proven beyond doubt, and the focus of the investigation shifted entirely to him. Juracich's decision to come forward played a pivotal role in ensuring that the true killer was brought to justice. Investigators didn't have to go far to track down Daniel Rolling. By the time they connected him to the Gainesville murders, he was already sitting in a jail cell in Ocala, Florida. He had been arrested months earlier, not for murder, but for robbing a grocery store just a week and a half after the final killing in his spree. This revelation explained why the murders had suddenly stopped. Rolling had been behind bars. Interestingly, this wasn't his first robbery. Investigators soon discovered that a bank had also been robbed on the same day one of the murders took place, linking the crimes even further. As they dug deeper, they began to piece together the evidence. Items recovered from the robbery, including tape and tools, were examined and found to match the materials Rolling had used in the murders. The connection was undeniable, but what sealed Rolling's fate was the forensic evidence. He had type B blood, the same blood type found at the crime scenes. But in a reckless move that would further incriminate him, Rolling had left behind something even more telling. Authorities uncovered a diary where he had scrawled confessions detailing his violent impulses and the horrific acts he had committed. His inability to keep his dark deeds to himself became his ultimate undoing. Once Rolling was charged with the murders, the case quickly moved toward trial. During the proceedings, it was revealed that Rolling had endured a traumatic and abusive upbringing. His father, a former police officer, had been violently abusive, inflicting both physical and emotional pain on Rolling throughout his childhood. This history of abuse may have provided some insight into the formation of Rolling's disturbed psyche, offering a glimpse into the darkness that consumed him. However, despite this background, it wasn't enough to mitigate the horror of his crimes. Rolling had brutally murdered 5 young people in the prime of their lives, terrorizing a community and leaving scars that would never fully heal. The court found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to death for his heinous actions. On October 25, 2006, after years of appeals, Daniel Rolling was executed by lethal injection. His death brought a sense of closure to many, but the trauma he had inflicted lived on in the memories of his victims' families and the Gainesville community. Yet Rolling's legacy of fear extended even further. In 1994, as Rolling's trial unfolded and his crimes became national news, a seemingly unrelated event occurred that would forever intertwine the Gainesville Ripper with pop culture. Kevin Williamson, an aspiring screenwriter, was watching an episode of Turning Point that chronicled the Gainesville murders. The show had a profound effect on him. Though Williamson's eventual screenplay for Scream wasn't a direct retelling of Rolling's story, the fear and paranoia that gripped him that night as he learned about the Ripper's gruesome acts found its way into the script. Scream became a cultural phenomenon, tapping into a deep-seated fear of home invasions and masked killers. In a way, the terror Rolling unleashed in Gainesville bled into popular culture, continuing to haunt audiences long after his death. The fear Williamson felt that night watching the show was passed down to all of us, woven into the fabric of the horror genre, ensuring that Rolling's influence would be felt for generations. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the heart of horror. If you've got any thoughts on the connection between real life and horror films, let me know in the comments below. And if you're curious to learn more about the true crime stories that inspired some of your favorite horror movies, be sure to check out our video on the real-life events that inspired The Strangers.